Thank you everyone for joining me for another episode of Sitting Down with Scholars. I'm Jordan and I'm joined this week by Dr. Shane Austin, a lecturer in biochemistry and Deputy Dean Outreach and Research for the University of the West Indies. And Shane, could you start off by just telling myself and my guests a bit about your research career so far?
Sure. Thanks for having me first, Jordan. Yeah, I would say one of the first things I'll tell you about my research is I basically research a number of things, which is quite wide. And I think it's one of those things you have to do when you're in a unique environment like the Caribbean. So I have research that focuses on biochemical education, where I'm trying to improve visual literacy and how students are able to understand kind of the images that they see in biochemistry textbooks. Then at the same time, I'm also researching uterine fibroids in Afro-Caribbean women, and these are benign masses that grow in the uteruses of women. And those masses really have impacts on quality of life for those women, and we're trying to identify if there's certain genetic markers, whether it be single nucleotide polymorphisms or some small things that change in a person's genetic makeup that could affect their ability to process a hormone or a vitamin or something differently. And the last area of research that I focus on is actually how organisms respond to extreme conditions. So there are lots of environments where organisms live in some really extreme conditions, whether it be high salt concentrations, high heat concentrations, or lack of oxygen, and how those organisms cope biochemically with those scenarios is very interesting at a mechanistic level. So what I mean biochemically is I think everybody always hears about proteins, fats, and carbohydrates. Kind of how those organisms deal with those major molecules is really interesting.
So I'd imagine with particularly a lot of very unique environments local to yourself, you get an opportunity to do quite a lot of field work. And I know from work that you've done with the SEB and various different societies that you're also engaged with, I'm sure you have an opportunity to really get out and also explore the environments where these phenomena are occurring as well.
Yes, so actually that's how I really got into that kind of work. I mean, my classical training had nothing to do with that kind of basically that's a form of ecophysiology and that kind of ecophysiological work. I'm not classically trained in that at all. I mean, in terms of my classical studies and my career progression, I didn't really do a whole lot of field work in my undergraduate or my graduate studies. For most of the time, I was in the lab looking at cancer cell lines. I was really inspired after being, in one specific environment where I do a lot of the work is called the intertidal zone. So it's the area between the high tide and low tide mark. And there's a really picturesque area here in Barbados where I live along the east coast of the island called Bathsheba. And there's some really nice intertidal pools. And I was there one day and I was thinking to myself, what happens to these organisms when it's low tide and they're kind of trapped in these intertidal pools? And that led me down a whole rabbit hole of research just by looking at a few papers in the literature. That's how I started this whole research scheme. And since then, I've had graduate students and countless undergraduate project students focus on various aspects of this. So yes, I do get to spend when I'm out in the field doing field work, a lot of time in the field. Nowadays, I do a lot more administration, so I spend less of the time in the field than I would love. But still, when I do, I always enjoy it.
It's really interesting to hear. And one of the things that fascinates me about your research journey, and when we've spoke before outside of the podcast, but more on society work, is what's outside of your core discipline. You also do a lot of work in the outreach space as well. And I know a lot of guests who are interested in academia generally would probably also be quite interested about your work and your research in outreach, and particularly with encouraging more scientists from the global south to have their work promoted and become more prominent.
Yeah, so I'm happy to share about that too. I think, one of the things, having been a Black scientist that studied in various spaces around the world, so I've done postgraduate studies in Canada as well as in Austria. I did my PhD in Vienna. I did my master's degree in Montreal. I think everybody kind of knows it and sees it, but, sometimes we don't really pay a lot of attention to it around us, how the diversity of persons, how they're represented in science. And it's really a challenge, especially for persons from some of those diverse backgrounds, persons who are from ethnic groups that are really underrepresented, women in science, persons who might have different sexual orientations than what might be normative in some societies. So I think all of those kind of classically what we call historical historically marginalized groups are really underrepresented. And there's a lot of research to show this. I mean, this is not just me speaking on it from, my observation, but I think anybody who is in science and makes observations will notice that. Now, there have been a lot of spaces and a lot of societies, learning societies and professional societies that have made concerted efforts to make changes to the diversity of persons and persons who show up in their society and day-to-day work in science. And I think all of those should be commended. I've worked with two societies so far in a really intimate way to do this, one of which is the Society for Experimental Biologists, which is where I met you, Jordan, and we were recently at their annual meeting. I do a lot of work with them. The primary work that I'm involved in through their outreach, education, and diversity group or working group is an awards nomination task force. And what that effectively is an opportunity for persons who are, again, from those underrepresented groups to be nominated for the awards in that society. And these are people that we're talking about who have done excellent work. It's not that, it's a diversity handout. We're talking about people who have done excellent work, but for whatever reason, their excellent work is maybe not being magnified at a global or on a global stage as you might imagine. They don't get that opportunity to be seen. And once they get the opportunity to be seen, then they become a lot more seen. So that's one of the major ways in which I've been contributing at the SCB. I've been chairing that task force now, I think, for 2 or 3 years. And we've had some really good successes out of our first year of working on improving those nominations. The other organization I work a lot with is the American Society. And that society, there I work as part of their Maximizing Access Committee. And effectively what that committee does is, as the name sounds, is increasing the access for persons to, resources of biochemistry and molecular biology. And we do a lot of things through a number of award fellowship opportunities, through travel grants, and also through providing professional development opportunities for persons from underrepresented minorities. The reality is there are a lot of scientists out there who don't see themselves in the classical pictures of science and a lot of how science is represented. And
it's interesting, like you say, and I know, just thinking of an example, when if you ask an AI to generate a picture of a scientist, very often it tends to be the very typical white man, lab coat, a number of beakers on the side, maybe a pocket protector in their shirt, that type of thing. What you imagine a caricature of characters, of a scientist, but one thing that I'm really interested in, Shane, and you articulated it very well from the outreach side and what has motivated you to really both encourage and to highlight the work of different scientists and researchers. But what drove you more down the path of biochemistry in general?
So I think the path of biochemistry is a really, really interesting one. I always tell my students when I'm advising them and giving them academic advising, I did not start as a biochemistry major. I was not always interested in biochemistry. Actually, when I entered university, I was a double major in biology. I thought biology was the path. I thought it was the truth, the way, and the light. After my first biology lab, I quickly pivoted away from that. I still remember the lab today. I still tell my students, I still tell the story. I walked in a room, I was like maybe 2 minutes I could have been more than 5 minutes late to the lab. And all I heard was begin. And when I looked around the room, there were just all of these trash cans filled with heliconia flowers. If you don't know what a heliconia flower is, you should go Google it. They were like literally a heliconia for every letter of the alphabet. And you had to come up with a dichotomous key to separate all of these different flowers and these different colors and shapes. And I was like, if this is what biology is, I don't want any part of it. So curiously enough, I ended up, it's not that I am averse to plants, but I don't know, something about that whole activity, I was just overwhelmed for my first university lab with that. So I pretty very quickly knew that biology was not for me. I was doing well at chemistry, and then in the second semester, I took a biochemistry course, and I was like, yeah, this is really what I want to do. And I quickly switched my major after my first year to a double major in chemistry and biology. The rest has been history ever since then. What I would say is, as I got more and more into the biochemistry program, mitochondria and metabolism as a whole really, really intrigued me a lot. How cells respond metabolically, and you still see that coming up in my research currently, is really an intriguing concept. Like how cells know how to respond to changing environments and what to do in terms of metabolism. To me, it makes for some of the most interesting and intriguing questions, I think, in biology.
So just to sum that up then, so some of those intriguing questions in terms of, I know when we hear a lot, especially with more on social media, I would say, than what we do particularly being circulated from researchers like yourself about the microbiome and the various different environments that are going on within ourselves. And What are some of those intriguing questions that really the field is trying to push for or trying to explore?
So I think that's a really good point. The point that you started with is probably where I will start and then dive in. There may be like three major areas that I think are super exciting, and there's a lot of scope for development currently in metabolism research and kind of those big questions or solutions to some of the big questions. The issue of the microbiome is a really good one. I think that's one of the things that everybody knows about and has heard something about. I think how people think about the microbiome maybe is not necessarily how scientists always think about it. This collection of organisms that can be on you, in you, and there's been a lot of work as to how those collection of microorganisms can actually change your metabolism. And I think there's a fairly good body of work that shows that it's something that can't be ignored. So I think a lot of studies that you see coming out now focusing on the microbiome also focus on, what's happening in the host and how is it also changing and altering metabolism through various molecular cues, either things that the microorganisms are doing or ways in which your body is responding to those microorganisms, how that changes your metabolism. So that's really one of those big areas. And I keep telling my students, I think within the next 15 to 20 years, I don't imagine that there are really going to be a lot of human studies and kind of deep investigations that can really ignore the microbiome any longer. Like I think it's a core part now of our understanding of human physiology and animal physiology more broadly. And I think we're going to see more and more of that coming into the research space. I think the second major thing I would want to talk about are tools used to identify some of these big questions. I think a field called metabolomics, which is like this ability to produce large data sets about things happening in metabolism, is a really exciting area. And those tools are what are going to help us break a lot of the big questions in the discipline. Metabolomics as a field, arguably, doctors would argue, has been around for a very long time. So when you go and you get a blood draw, a doctor will tell you, well, I mean, that's a metabolic test, right? They're measuring usually some kind of metabolite, or they can measure some kind of metabolite, and humans have been doing this for quite a while in medicine. But our ability to measure lots of those metabolites at the same time has been improving a lot over the last decade or two. And I think we've reached a point where we're becoming really skilled at doing that, like looking at lots of different metabolites all at the same time. And having that large amount of data is really giving us a very unique picture of biology. I think classically biology, as as I was just discussing, has kind of looked at 1-2 metabolites in very distinct tests in very distinct ways, but never looking at the big picture. And I think everybody could appreciate this kind of idea about big data. And big data is a thing now. I think even the average layperson has heard something about big data. And the idea is, how can you have big data about metabolites, and what can you use that to inform about biology and how the human body works or how animals work? I think a lot of those tools are going to help us crack the big questions that we have. And some of the last big questions that I think really apply also a lot to cancer research, which is where most of my theoretical grounding has been through my studies, is immunometabolism. How the immune system and metabolism are deeply intertwined and interplaying. I think for a long time, there's been a lot of focus on metabolism as it relates to cancer research, and there's been a whole slew of research recently, again, over, I would say, about the last decade or maybe two, because we're now in 2025, that has kind of explored how the immune system and immune cells change their metabolism, and how metabolism changes how you may get certain types of immune responses, and how that can relate to malignancies in the body or just how the body functions overall. I think there's a lot of good data on that, and I think there are a lot of big questions still to be answered on that, especially when you start thinking about that in the context of certain chronic diseases and things like obesity. I think there's still some really big questions to be answered in that area.
It's interesting because I know, speaking to a number of different guests before, particularly those who've got backgrounds in neuroscience, it's one of those famous phrase where people say the whole. I've heard people talk about the metabolism for various different diseases. If I had a penny for every time, I would have 2 or 3 pennies, but it's still off of a link between those two different fields, like those researchers who are looking at Alzheimer's disease and how the connection between the gut microbiome and metabolism. The same looking at other different conditions and how they effectively look at the various different problems. It's really interesting to see, like you say, see the more holistic view, where typically I would say more traditional papers or research methods have often adopted more very investigative approaches to look for a particular hormone, a particular protein, or various different elements that they're looking for in that plant, animal, or human when they're looking at various different treatments. And I know particularly when I've done it more from the animal research, working more with ruminants and so on, it tends to be antibiotics tends to be the focus, as I'm sure most people wouldn't be surprised about, because that the rumen being so delicate in terms of its balance. But it's such a range of research taking place at the moment, which is really fascinating. But one of the things I want to find out a bit more about, whether it's your field, Shane, or whether it's yourself as a researcher, who's really, would you say, inspired you to be who you are today, either professionally or personally where you are?
That's a really good question. I guess that would have changed at different points in my career, but you asking me that now, Jordan, I think a lot of, the way I approach my job, the way I approach research, and the way I approach interacting with students and supervising students and so on has actually been shaped by my mentor and master's studies supervisor. So that would be Dr. Julie St. Pierre. I was her first graduate student when she moved to McGill. And I think I really learned a lot about scientific process, how to approach a question, how to really do deep scientific work and research from her. I think there was a lot of rigor in her instruction. Perhaps maybe not all of it was valuable at that point in time. And I think, or what I want to say is not that it wasn't all valuable. I think I didn't get the value of it, is what I want to say, of what I was learning from her, necessarily all of it at the same time. But I think now, looking at myself in an academic role, I definitely see a lot of the things that, she would have instructed and mentored me through are really helpful and unbelievably helpful. And a number of times I just refer to her, usually in a week, is uncanny. So I think I did get a lot out of that experience. And I think, Julie's mentorship and supervision really did help shape who I am as a scientist today, how I approach questions, how I approach student supervision, how I approach teaching. I think a lot of it really comes from interactions that I would have had with Julie. And as I said, I don't think I necessarily recognized it all until I was in this role that I am in today. But I think there are lots of people who influence your life. But I think in this role, in this time, I think definitely looking back, reflecting on, I think, her supervision really helped me, or helped prepare me for this.
It's really interesting. And this is normally a question I ask my guests a bit later on in the segment, but it's something that I want to really bring forward. And it's normally how you're shaped by your heritage, both academic and your personal heritage. Because what I find with this type of question is when people think about their personal heritage, they tend to think about their characteristics. But when they think about their academic heritage, what the mentors that have taught them or imparted their wisdom to, how they've been taught, and how that basically the student learning process in terms of how you develop as a teacher yourself from that process. You learn from someone else, and then your skills are passed on to someone else, and the legacy that goes from that academic heritage. So I'm wondering, from reflections with either Julie, like you say, or with other mentors that you've had over the years, how have they shaped your academic heritage?
That's a really good question. And I think it's a question that I can't imagine I've really ever heard a lot of people ask or heard an answer to. In terms of my academic heritage, I have the unique, I guess, privilege of working with people who actually taught me. So the institution that I'm teaching at currently is actually the institution that I did my undergraduate degree at. So a lot of the staff here that I work with on a day-to-day basis are actually people who actually would have taught me. And I think that's a really unique position to be in. Because a lot of the ways that I approach sometimes explanations to students and, communicating content would be based on how I saw them communicate content, what I knew was effective that they might have been doing when they were instructing me. So coming back to the main question, because I guess I wanted to preface that to give you context for why I say that. I think I learned a lot from my undergraduate instructors, like the simplicity of what really works to deliver a message and the importance of enthusiasm. I definitely got a lot of that from the people who instructed me here. I mean, throughout the course of my graduate studies, I didn't really do a whole lot of coursework. So to be honest, most of how I approach teaching, I learned from my undergraduate experience. And I think most of that I learned from people who are now my colleagues for the most part. Like I would say about 70% of them are people who I still work with on a day-to-day basis. So it's really interesting to also see how their style has evolved. as we all become older, I think things change. And, like a lot of them, I even have one colleague that I tell him all the time, like, you've softened. Like, I remember when he taught me, it was a very different time, clearly. Like, there were no lecture notes posted. You had to sit and write everything. Like, you just had to write. And he's totally changed. But the point that I'm making, though, is I think a lot of the people that I'm surrounded by are the same people who inspired me. And it's good to see how they have changed and how they've continually improved, and now to share ideas with them about how you can communicate education and help students learn is really important. From a research perspective, as I said, I have spoken about my experience with Julie, and that was a great experience. And I think Julie was probably one of the best supervisors, anybody could have asked for, especially for somebody who was supervising their first graduate student at that McGill University. I thought that, Julie did a spectacular job. But for my PhD, I also had two supervisors. And I'll be honest, when I got into that particular program, and I was like, I can't imagine this time. And so then when I actually got into the program, I actually realized how useful it could be. And I think what I would learn from that and what I gained from the academic heritage, having two supervisors, is really the importance of deep and meaningful collaboration. I think people talk a lot about collaboration, but I think if you have two people who really work well together and who really, it really becomes a synergy. Like, you get something that's really greater than the additive parts. So you don't just get half and half and end up with one whole supervisor with one whole project and idea, but you actually end up with something like 1.5 projects and ideas, because really, the half and half, when they come together, is greater than just the sum of it. I would say for my PhD and for my PhD supervisors, I really learned the importance of deep and meaningful collaboration. And both of them really had wide collaboration networks. So what that meant for me is not only was I just working with two separate people, but if you imagine each one of them having, like, if you're looking at a network map, various collaborations, and they're introducing you to people and helping you network with people when you go to meetings with them, it really helps improve, I think, your understanding of the respective fields, and also, gives you kind of the tools you need to be a successful academic and scientist. And that's what I really got out of the experience of my PhD supervision. I really feel like out of that, the thing that I was able to distill the most out of my PhD was the ability and importance of really good.
It's interesting, like you say, and I know from thinking of my very recent supervisory team that's effectively been around having two education focused researchers, and then having one who's biology focused, and the contrast between how a biologist approaches biology education versus how an educationalist approaches education research, and how that enhances and changes your way of thinking as you go through it. So I can completely see that. And I would certainly be an advocate for that multi-layered supervisory team, because it does, like you say, it offers a multitude of different pathways you can take your work into and so on. But one of the things that I think is really interesting about that is, like you say, the colleague relationship that you've now got with some of those people who've had that formative impact on your experience. What is that relationship like, if you don't mind me asking? Because it's one of those things that I'm sure many people, the transition from student to colleague and so on, must be a different change.
Yeah, I think, I could see how that transition could be really challenging if you have not had an opportunity to gain some space. So for me, I had the advantage of, yes, I did my undergraduate degree here, and all these people, they taught me and they did a really good job, and they were so happy to see me progress and move on to postgraduate studies. But then at the end of it, I did my postgraduate studies for a reasonably long period of time, almost a decade, outside of their immediate area. I mean, we still kept in contact. I kept in contact with at least 3 or 4 of the academic staff members here while I was doing my various postgraduate studies. But it offered me, I guess, the space away from here. Equally, I never really imagined that I would have been in this role. This, taking up this position or this lectureship in biochemistry was not really, it wasn't my life goal. I would have been happy at the end of my PhD to move on to a postdoc and do something else and maybe have my own lab. Maybe I would have gone into industry. To be honest, I really wasn't certain when I was in the throes of my PhD what the next step would look like. It was just serendipitous that, somebody was retiring and somebody said to me, well, why don't you apply? Just apply, see what will happen. You're not finished your PhD, but you're going to be finished soon enough, and maybe you'll apply and they'll want you. And that's exactly what happened. I applied, and clearly I was the best candidate that they had, and what or had what they thought they needed at the point in time. But I think coming back to work with those people who taught you as colleagues really has not been a challenge for me. I can't say that I've really experienced any challenges, any disrespect, I think they've had nothing but the most respect for me. And I think if anything, it has really shown and shaped how I approach my students as well, because I come to my students now with the recognition that these people may well be my colleagues in another 10, 15, 20 years. How I approach them, how I approach their ideas, how I approach what they're saying, what they are teaching me is really important. These are not just some people that I'm having this transactional experience with in a course and maybe I'll never see them again. There's a strong possibility that I could probably see one or two of them again, and I'll be faced with them as colleagues. So I think that really does, or for me, having had that experience of working with people who taught me, I think really has changed and shaped a lot about how I approach my education practice and how I really instruct my research students as well. Because for me, the rigor that I apply to them is to what they're doing in the research space is because I know you can be a colleague and I may depend on your data and I may depend on you having a set of expertise, and I need to know that you're applying good scientific practice and doing things you need to do. And I view it that way.
Anything like you say, and one of the things that I find really interesting is they're almost approaching your pedagogic practice that you're almost feeding forward, which is a term typically used in industry more so than looking at it from an academic principle, but where potentially, like you say, you're having to go about your practice, or not having to, but choosing to, because you might work with that person in the future and you want them to be as successful as possible, which we should want for our students anyway, or that you're wanting to really support them in the best way that you can, because they might be a colleague, a contact, or whoever in the future, and looking at it from that really outside, broader perspective, rather than necessarily, like you say, the student-teacher relationship, which is typical. Student goes through qualifications, student leaves, student goes off to whatever, and then if they come back type approach, which is more I would say the lackadaisical view that some approaches might have. But so as someone who's a strong advocate of feeding forward, I think that's a really great position to be. But it also leads really good and really well into the next point, which is, I suppose, your impact more broadly. What do you hope that will be, whether that's your teaching, your research, or personally?
Well, that's a big question. What my impact more broadly? But it's okay. I mean, it gets you thinking, right?
That it is, yeah.
I mean, I don't know if there's any one thing that I really want to say is going to be my impact or the impact let me rephrase it. If there was an impact that I wanted to leave, I really would have to say, especially in this moment, is really to ensure, kind of what the face of science looks like is truly representative of people who do science. I feel like that's probably, if there was one impact that I really want to have, would be that. It's not that I feel like it is more important than, the impact that I want my research to have or the impact that I want my teaching to have on my students. But the reason I say that is I just feel like that is just a deep point that has the ability it has the ability to permeate into everything else. It has the ability to permeate into outreach. It has the ability to permeate into the education structures that we build. It has the ability to permeate into the research that we do. And it's just for that reason that I really feel that could have some of the biggest impacts. And if we can make seismic shifts in how people see and think about science. And when I talk about people, it's not only just scientists. I mean, yes, I think there are a lot of scientists out there who, as you rightly said, Jordan, their view of a scientist is not going to change from what AI has put out as, kind of that stereotypical white male in a lab coat, somewhere doing science, because that's for them. When they look around their lab, that's what they see. And the idea is, how do we help them change that? How do we help them recognize that? I think, there are lots of things that societies and organizations, when I talk about societies, I mean professional societies, can do to help reflect that. I mean, like, one of the things that I really feel is important is also like this kind of directed evolution to help things look the way that you want. So if your goal is to have more diversity in science, well, we have to build things in to ensure there's more diversity in science. We can't just say, well, we're going to have a symposium, or we're going to have a symposium at the annual meeting, and then it's just all men speaking, or it's just all people from one geographical area speaking with not, an ethnic minority in sight. So it has to be that we're ensuring that everybody gets an opportunity to present their work. And as I always come back to, it's not to say that we're just going to give people handouts and say, well, here's your ethnic minority card and your opportunity to do this. There are lots of people out there doing really good work that are from ethnic minorities, but they don't get the opportunity to be seen. And I think that opportunity to be seen is so important. So if we take like a directed evolution approach and we just simply say, well, we're going to try to ensure that at least a third of the presenters are women, or at least half of the presenters are women, or from underrepresented minority groups, it gives those persons an opportunity to be seen. And usually once they become seen, that starts to propel. And there's a lot of research on this. Research has demonstrated this, that once persons get seen, then they get another speaking engagement. Then somebody nominates them for a prize. People in their respective departments see them doing all of these different things and start to recognize the value of their work more. So I really feel like making an impact in that one space has the ability to impact how those persons from those underrepresented minorities will change how science education is executed. Hopefully they provide what the experts will call like aspirational capital from other persons who are from underrepresented minorities. Those persons can then see themselves in these persons that are becoming amplified. Outreach opportunities, there's automatically going to be built in more diversity because the lay public then starts to see an image of a scientist that is something other than just what their caricature representation of a scientist is. And at the end of the day, those persons from diverse backgrounds will speak up when they see biases in research, and they will also speak up about ensuring diverse perspectives in the research. So for me, I think that that's the one thing that I would want to hopefully have the greatest impact in, and hope that it will really make a change in all those areas of science as a result.
It's interesting though. One of the things that what you said that really highlighted for me is when I was thinking all the way back to now, just over a decade ago, when I was looking around my undergraduate course, 4 undergraduate courses going around, and you don't really pay when you're from the majority group, you don't really notice it till you're in the research area where you're focusing on it because of the privilege that you're afforded from the position to not have to notice. But I can remember when I was going through my undergraduate, and there was one student who was from a minority group, and one of the things that tended to happen is any promotional material, they were always in that promotional material, overrepresented them. But in a lot of cases, that was you could in the benefit of hindsight, it's more of a tokenistic gesture of okay, we're going to roll out this individual again because we're trying to show how diverse we are, and but it's a tokenistic gesture from the institution rather than actual any form of action to really have that benefit. And with the benefit of hindsight, I know how problematic that was, but at the time, you can only empathize and sympathize with that individual who's being constantly asked to be that face that representation when realistically they know they're representing something that is systematically not changing. And that's the challenge especially for someone who in their own position is a very early stage career in their second year of their undergraduate course, and in that element therefore might decide, I'm not going to pursue science because all I'm getting is I'm getting put on a platform every time there's an event, but I'm not getting supported in other ways. And that's something that it must be so unfathomably hard for someone in that position that I can't even imagine it from the position that I fortunately sit in, that I just can't see it from their perspective because I haven't had any of that experience.
Yeah, so I think that's a really important point, and I think that that's sometimes the difficulty with persons from underrepresented minorities that they face. They almost have, and again, there's been research on this, and it's almost like there's a tax applied to them, even in the academic space. So if you find yourself in a department where, for instance, you're the only underrepresented minority, you're the only person of color, and you end up almost always doing the diversity work, you end up with this tax because you're a person of color doing the work related to diversity, when in principle, you're probably not the person who needs the greatest expertise or, who needs to be exposed to the diversity work. It probably may benefit one of your other colleagues who are not from a diverse background to really be doing this work, to rather expand their horizons and, think about things differently than they are thinking. So it really does become a tax, persons who are from those underrepresented minorities when they are kind of, especially in tokenistic roles like what you were describing, where really there is no benefit and really they're being forced. Well, forced is a big word. I don't want to say, but really they're being asked to portray something that doesn't exist. Come and demonstrate this diversity when you are the only Black person in the program. You're the only person of color in this program, but yet you're going to come and, make it seem like, oh, well, clearly there's diversity and clearly everybody's well represented, but that's not the reality. So I could see how that could be very harmful. And, those are the kind of things that I feel, and that's why I said one of the biggest impacts I want is to make science representative. I feel the more we get people overall, all scientists, to recognize that there are problems and issues with things like that stuff like that structurally could be damaging, the better it will be, because then you get an opportunity for persons to speak up. I think, you were reflecting on it, and in hindsight, Jordan recognizes, the damage that could cause and how that could be harmful. And I'm sure you would speak up about it, having now had that knowledge. So the point that I'm making is, I think the more we get people to think about these things and talk about these things, the more likely there is to be change systematically.
No, absolutely. And I think it's interesting. So another example that's come up and where I've had more of an opportunity to be a voice in this room in the right way, I would say, is when you have recruitment panels and in different roles before, when they were talking about typically, we need to have a completely gender balanced recruitment panel. And then you have the argument, okay, in principle, a gender-balanced recruitment panel makes sense. But if you're having the same two people who are women always on that panel, and most of their work therefore ends up being on that panel, and they aren't getting recognized or rewarded for it, and it's like, look, we recognize what you're trying to do here, but because we aren't necessarily recruiting any more diversity in this area, we're just simply having a more diverse panel. It doesn't help the people, and it's actually causing more of a problem for the people who are in that position. Then the argument is in that position, and what I found, again, is privileged to be able to step back, is the fact that when you highlight the problem and say, look, we know there's a problem here. How should we change it? Do you mind leading that and saying that we'll support it, but we'll follow your lead on it, and you tell us what we need to do, and being prepared to both bring that up and let someone else take the reins on it, rather than being in a position where, this is something I'm going to lead because I know exactly how to solve it, because you can't when you haven't got that perspective. You can do a lot of initiatives there to support that, but you should be a supporter, not a leader in that position.
Yeah. No, and I think that's one of the prime examples. Like, there are very few women in the department. As you said, you're not making a directed and concerted approach to how can we get more women into the department, such that this, the burden of, or not the burden, but, this workload of ensuring a gender diverse panel doesn't always fall on the same two people with the same requests. And I think that that's such a great example, of the kind of thing that we're talking about. And, sometimes the need for, I think, institutions and persons to really sit with themselves, sit with where they are, identify and acknowledge various privileges that they have. I mean, everybody has privileges. That's just part of, the state of how our society is constructed. But I think an ability to sit with the privileges that you have and understand how those privileges, you might have used them, whether intentionally or unintentionally, and kind of think about, okay, well, how can I use this now to ensure that it's more equitable, ensure that there's more diversity? I think those are really some of the big conversations that I really want more institutions and more people to sit, take a moment, reflect, think about. And I think once we do that, we hopefully will start to see more changes in how things are in science.
Like you say, we can only hope on that one. And what I want to pivot into now, Shane, is a bit of a segment which is a bit of a way of breaking up what is advice section that you'll have for the next generation. But before I get into that, I want to allow my guests to know a bit more about you, which is the 10 words, finding out your story in 10 words or less. And to start off with, so these will be 5 rapid fire questions. I won't have very much follow up after these. But it's more just to give them a bit of a deep dive into yourself in a bit of a fun segment. So to start off with, what did you want to be when you were younger?
A doctor.
How do you want people to see you?
Compassionate, caring individual.
And can you describe your field or body of work in 10 words or less?
There's so many things. I guess biochemical education, that's 3 of them. Benign growths in women, that's 4. And that leaves me with 3 more to explain a big area. Probably ecophysiology of organisms. And that's my 10.
What is the biggest challenge in your field?
I think the heterogeneity of research, because there's so many different organisms and so many different things, the heterogeneity of the research.
And the last question, what is a surprising fact about you?
I grow orchids for fun.
Yeah, that's different, especially as that's going all the way back to the plant point. Having an interest in plants, really fun.
Yeah, which is funny, right?
Yeah, funny full circle.
Exactly. It started with me disliking tropical flowers, and now I grow tropical flowers for fun. Yeah, who would have thought?
Now, moving into more questions well, not necessarily questions, but more supportive areas where you can help the next generation outside of the work that you already do, is to start off with, what would be a piece of advice that you would give to someone who's just starting out?
I would say, embrace the ability to say no to opportunities. And I know that might sound a little bit strange at first. I think when you're first starting out, especially if you're first starting out in academia as a graduate student, or even if you're first starting out in academia with your own independent research, there are usually a lot of opportunities. There are lots of abilities to collaborate and, work with people and so on. And yes, as I said, collaboration is really important, but I think you also have to be a little bit strategic and focus on what you want your goals to be. Ultimately, know on where you want to go and what direction you want to take things. I think even administratively, the same thing applies. There'll be lots of responsibilities. There's usually more work than there are good people to do the work. And as a result, you can easily end up also doing a lot of that work. But I think being strategic, doing things that you really have a passion about, and taking on responsibilities that you really have a passion about, taking on research collaborations that you really can see working out and that you really can build a lasting relationship with persons. It's easy to have multiple collaborations when they're all over in a year. And maybe you get a publication, maybe you don't. But I think if you have those kind of lasting collaborations where you can really do deep work over several years, then those I have found to be really fruitful, working with individuals that you can really build up almost a body of work together. And then you kind of almost establish yourselves as experts in the field collectively. Or maybe the person's an expert in the field from the time you start the collaboration. But I think, having the ability to discern and recognize those things and maybe say no to some of the earlier opportunities.
Like you say, I think it's interesting thinking about that academic network. I know from principally whilst in academic societies as well as through more academic social media, the amount of relationships that are very early days still, but are still, you can see, are growing very quickly into what could be productive relationships. And you think, surprising to think where these various areas can come from. I know this conversation has come about through our mutual work with the Society for Experimental Biology as an example, and working on a cross-institutional project myself with other people from the same society. We recently had a paper published together as an example. So different things like that you can have where there's all that collaboration. But like you say, I think that the key point to pull out is that strategic overarching aim, because it's so easy in academia to go down so many avenues and then you look like you are very indecisive because you look like you're going this way, then you could do that quite easy.
I think that's exactly it. Having the ability to be strategic. Maybe that's the advice, and not learning how to say no. But I think also saying no is difficult, I think, in the context of what you said, somebody's starting out, because, lots of senior people may approach you. And this is the one bit of advice I would give now, being somebody, I don't know if senior is the right word, but now being somebody in administration sometimes who asks people to take on responsibilities. People sometimes think that because somebody more senior to you or with administrative responsibilities asking you about an opportunity, you are automatically committed to saying yes. Sometimes people are genuinely asking, do you have capacity to do this? Do you feel like you can do this? Is this something you're actually interested in? And I think, there is nothing wrong with saying no if it doesn't align with your purpose, doesn't align with where you want to go. It doesn't align with immediately kind of what you have in your sights. And I think apply that to administration, but also apply it to your research. There are lots of opportunities sometimes for collaborations. But as I said, what I have found to be really successful and works really well, at least from my career, has been building kind of those lasting collaborations where it's not just about one paper, it's not just about one conference proceeding, it's not just about one abstract, but really building something that you can come back and build a real body of work from.
No, I think that's definitely, I know for a lot of people who listen to the podcast who are thinking about that first step into academia, whether that's even at the undergraduate opportunities that they can pick up through internships or finding that potential supervisor who might be not necessarily someone they work with at the institution they're at now, but it might be someone that they re-network with again later in their career, and who knows when that'll happen. You don't want to dismiss the relationships, even if you sometimes dismiss saying, I'm going to do that particular piece of work and so on. But speaking of dismissing the chain, is there any subjects that you, in the benefit of hindsight, dismissed outright that potentially came back to a bit later in your life?
Probably two things. One outside of my field is French. I remember French. I totally dismissed French when I was in the equivalent of third form in secondary school. I remember the French teacher gave a quiz or a test. I don't know. I got some ridiculously low grade, let's say a 25. She gave us back the feedback on the test, gave the same test later the week. I think I got less. I was totally disinterested and disengaged from French. Then turns out, a decade and some later, I end up living in a city that speaks French as one of the major languages. And I came back and then ended up spending some time learning French while I was in Montreal. Granted, you didn't need it to survive in Montreal, truthfully. I mean, you could survive quite well just speaking English, but I came back to it later and I was like, look at this. I think in terms of my field, I don't know if it's something that I had shelved, but one thing that when I first did a course on bioinformatics when I was in my undergraduate program, we had a course on bioinformatics, and that course was very theoretical in nature. So for people who don't know what bioinformatics is, it's basically like when you collect all these large sets of biological data or any kind of data that's related to biology, how you can use computers and various computing tools and strategies to sort through that data and make sense of it, either storing it in a database or just actually sifting through it. And the course was very theoretically based in bioinformatics. So it was very much based on the theory behind a lot of the techniques. So the theory behind PAM searches and Blossom and all these things. And I never really, at the point in time, I never really understood it. I always thought let me rephrase it. I never really understood why I was learning it. I understood the content of it. I understood the importance of doing binary searches and all these things, but I was always like, this is just they're just this thing that they're making me learn. I can't really see how this would be useful. And then later on during my PhD, when I had lots of bioinformatics and I had proteomics data to sort through, actually having that knowledge of what the databases do, how the actual search algorithms work, came back to be exceptionally useful. And I was really happy that I had done the course. And granted, I didn't remember everything, but at least knowing how those things worked and having that kind of knowledge that I could go back and say, I remember something vaguely about this, actually turned out to be quite useful.
No, it's really interesting. Like you say, I think that's the same. I can remember doing an undergrad class with bibliometrics and didn't think that was very relevant at all till my PhD, when I thought, oh yeah, bibliometrics now has a lot of relevance to it. The same as I've also dismissing art as a GCSE and then using art in the research methods because it became a best way of expressing participants' opinions. So yeah, it's surprising how things come full circle eventually, potentially for a lot of people anyway. So thinking about your role, Shane, that you have, so you are in one of those very different positions where you have outreach, teaching, and research responsibilities. But if you were given an unlimited pot of money, which, let's be honest, never happens in academia, how would you split your time if you were given that luxury between outreach, teaching, and research, if you were given that blank check?
To be honest, I really love teaching. I enjoy being in the classroom. I enjoy hearing the perspectives of students. I think the more I took on administrative responsibilities, the more I enjoy teaching even more. I always say, when you go to meetings, you walk into meetings, sometimes you cannot predict how the meeting will go. You have no clue. One person will say something and the meeting will take a total left turn. And then before you know it, the meeting has gone down some tangential pathway that you're like, how did we end up here? And sometimes, especially if I'm chairing the meeting, I try as very hard as possible to ensure that we're all walking away from the meeting, at least with some kind of next steps. But sometimes, just because of the nature of the discussions and the weight and the magnitude of stuff within a university environment, you can't always walk away with some immediate deliverable and what will be the immediate next step. And so sometimes that can be a little bit frustrating. But I feel like whenever I walk into the classroom, there are always going to be questions from students. There are always going to be students who may not understand something, giving me opportunities to, just try again to explain it, try a different analogy, try something else. And those kind of things and those kind of challenges I really enjoy. I always say when students ask me a question in the classroom, most of the time I know the answer. And if I don't, usually that's when it's actually interesting for me even more, because it's like, then I get to actually go and search and figure out, well, what is the answer to that? Because most of the time, if they ask me a question and I'm stumped, I'm actually then become quite curious about what the answer to that question is. So I really enjoy teaching for those reasons. Like being in the classroom with students and their energy is really unmatched. So I probably would spend about 40, if not 50% of my time teaching and doing stuff, probably a little bit more teaching than I do now. And I think teaching at all levels, the graduate and undergraduate level, I would want to spend more time doing. I love outreach. I really do love outreach. So if I had a chance, I probably would then want to spend about maybe 30% of my time doing like outreach, actually being out in the community. And if I could spend 30% of my working hours in a week doing outreach every week, I'd be very happy. Like, actually interacting with people who may not have a deep understanding of science, don't really quite understand, things about biology or chemistry or whatever, and really helping people understand that in context of something else I find really exciting. And the rest of the time I would spend doing research, because I had unlimited money. So I'd have unlimited postdocs and graduate students and people actually doing the bench science, and then actually being able to have the kind of deep conversations and building the kind of lab hierarchy that I would have experienced. And then you really get an opportunity, I think, in an unlimited resource environment to really do the kind of research and science that you want to do, where your questions are not necessarily, and your hypotheses are not necessarily limited by what you can do and the equipment you have available, but really just limited by, what becomes possible in a time frame. And that's the kind of science that I would love to do. And I probably would love to spend the rest of my time doing that, like another 30% of my time. So if it was 30, 30, 40, I'd be pretty happy.
That sounds great. And just thinking, just because we're getting up to the end of our time together, Shane, so to start off with, just briefly, what question would you have for my next guest? So it's something that I always try to do on this podcast, asking a question forward. What would be your question?
So I'll maybe preface that with a little bit of why I would have this as a question. So I was recently, a few weeks ago, I was acting dean for the dean because the dean took leave. And when I first started out in academia, I was really on top of my productivity game. Like I was really good about productivity and how to approach productivity and having systems in place. And I guess somewhere along the lines of doing it for several years, I kind of relaxed things more and more and more. But then actually being in the role of acting dean and having this additional responsibility on top of all of my other responsibilities, I quickly became, inundated with lots of emails every day. And I had to go back to like the fundamentals of what I had learned about productivity a long time ago. A number of times I check my email just to manage and ensure I get everything done and ensure that you get some kind of work done and you're not always just responding to, requests that people have and things that people want to know and those kinds of things. So I say all that to say, one of the key things that a lot of people who are very deep in productivity and some of the most productive people also do is they just do something just for fun. Like you really need to have something that helps you just switch off, something that you're not doing with any goal or intention. So I would probably ask that person, like, what do you do that doesn't have a goal or an intention? Like, what do you do just completely to switch off? For me, I spend a lot of time drawing. So I think about a year and a half ago, I started like a sketchbook practice where I just have a sketchbook and I just draw. I draw dogs, I draw people, I draw landscapes, I draw stuff. And it doesn't have to be spectacular drawings. As I said, I approach it with zero expectations. I'll try to draw anything. Some of the drawings are, by my estimation, are really good, and some of them, by my estimation, are really terrible, and I wouldn't want people to. But I do it just for fun, and I do it just for me. So I would want to know, what does that person do?
Final part of the segment is really the question from my last guest for you, which is, what was one of your internal biases that you are currently trying to get over?
I think from as early in my academic career as I can remember, when I entered university, and maybe even before when I was doing A levels, I guess my friends and I and all the people around me who studied science, we always had this view of things like the humanity and the social sciences were these softer, less concrete things. And I guess, without recognizing it, by holding those views, you kind of almost make them inferior in your mind to science. And one of the major challenges then you find or at least I've found them working in a university, in an academic environment, where you meet people who are functioning at a very high level in these disciplines, is because you still have somewhere in your mind that bias, that implicit bias that, or that bias that you've developed, that these things are not as rigorous, or because they approach their questions differently, or their hypotheses are tested differently to how you might embed science, that is not as valid or not as rigorous. I think that's been a really hard bias to get over in a big academic environment. And I always have to remind myself, their field and their discipline has processes, and sometimes they don't understand what scientists are talking about, and sometimes we don't understand what they're talking about, but it doesn't make what either of us is doing invalid. And I think that has really been, in terms of a bias in the academic sphere, that I've really been challenged with for a long time. It's been that, because for a very long time, I've always thought, well, how do you read a novel and then form an academic thesis around this? For me, it's always been like, that does not seem in any way concrete or objective as science. But the last thing I'll say about that is, and I recently read a set of articles about it, is, science sometimes is not, we think that science is this purely objective pursuit, and, we approach things in this very concrete way and we do things. But there's a lot of science that we do that actually, there are a lot of things that are quite subjective. And we don't think about it, we don't acknowledge it, and scientists just think, we are this purely objective pursuit of knowledge. And then you think about, well, I buy all my reagents from one manufacturer without ever thinking about or trying another manufacturer. I don't know what the other manufacturer's quality of product is, but yet I hold this one manufacturer to be exceptionally superior. It's the only thing I will buy from my lab. In principle, without you having tried the other manufacturers, you don't really know. You're making a subjective decision based on either marketing or, your experience, or the experience of somebody, a mentor maybe. Sometimes you don't have objective metrics for some of the decisions that we make. But yet we feel like, science is this highly, or bench science at least, is this highly objective thing, only driven by data. And sometimes we just don't have the data that supports some of the things we do. I'm not saying everything, but some of the things sometimes really are not supported by data. They're just about our feelings and our opinions about stuff, and we don't recognize it. And I mean, that's just one example, the reagents. I mean, there are countless others.
I mean, like you say, there's examples that I can think of that are becoming quite topical at the moment, where even entire experimental designs, particularly in like medicine, where entire cohorts have just not been looked at all, because at the time it didn't seem like it was relevant to look at that cohort. And separating the cultural social elements from the scientific method is could potentially cause such a bias in that article to be overrepresented in other papers or bodies of work in the future. And that impact could be very minimal, or it could be massive, depending on the body of work that it's led to.
Yeah, that's affecting. Yeah, I agree 100%. So I think for me, that has been one bias that, I always have to take a step back and remind myself, they do things differently, but it doesn't mean that it's wrong. It doesn't mean that it's inferior to science. It doesn't mean that, the quality of their work and what they produce is any less, that it's any less rigorous. It's any less hard to produce. I think coming up in the academic tradition, you think, well, I mean, all they're reading is books. We spent hours in the lab just to get something, and they just read a book. It almost, you feel like, well, the effort they've put in compared to the effort I've put in, it's not the same, but it's different. But it doesn't mean that what is generated is any less worth.
And that, on that point, that's a really good area to, I think, finish this segment on, Shane. So from myself and from my guests, thank you very much for joining us. And I will tag Shane in posts where I can link to his profile so you can find out more about his work. And I will attach his ORCID ID for you to read various papers that he's written.
Thank you so much, Jordan. Thank you so much for having me. It's been a great conversation.